Hello everybody and welcome back to day 55 today of 100 days of code, and we're back at it. I'm following along with Max's tutorial. I'm just spinning up my server here now and we'll get started in just a moment. So I'm just going to listen to what Max is saying. Yesterday we finished off by extracting out our form validation into its own hook. So that's being done in its own hook now, so that is super. And here is our project. So great. Come on. Okay, so there we go. Perfecto selecto. Oh. Okay. So there we go. And now if I just open up my dev tools, I'll move my cup of tea out of the way. Not before a sip, of course. So open up my dev tools and we're ready to go. So let's have a listen to what Max has to say. Okay, so now we're in our app.js component, and rather than our simple input, here we want to use our basic form. Okay, so we'll just switch that out for our basic form, which is just another component that we have made, which is here, which we haven't actually done any changes to yet. So we're going to have to make some changes. Yeah, so we just used our basic form, but we haven't actually imported it. So if we come back here, basic form, we need to import this. So we just say import basic form. There we go. And it does the autocomplete for us. This error should go away and we will compile then. So great. And now we have a different form, as you can see. So basic form is not defined. It's okay, we won't worry about that for a moment, but you can see now we have a form with 3 input fields, a name, a last name and an email address. And we're probably just going to do the same thing now with this basic form by using this custom hook. So that's great, a bit more practice for us, but let me just make sure. Yeah. Yeah, so he just said, okay, cool, so we are applying this, great. Cool, so what we're going to do now is apply the same things into this new form. So if we remember, we have our use input hook here. So we've made this custom hook, and this custom hook is there in order to allow us to put validation into each individual form component, our inputs, by using this approach instead. And then we can use this hook, which is just taking in the entered value, doing some tests on it, checking if it's valid or not. And the way it's checking if it's valid is by a different function that's passed in. So if we come back to our simple input here, we can see that when we call our use input hook here, we pass in that function that we want to validate it on, and then we have the various properties that we can pull out of this use input hook. So let's just implement this, and then that might make it a bit more obvious and straightforward. And do watch yesterday's video because I go through actually building this if you're stuck. So in here in our basic form, we're going to use that new hook. So we will just create a constant object, and we will equal this to our use input hook. So there we go, we have autocomplete coming up there, and we just pass the bracket notation. And what we want to actually pass in here, it's expecting this validate value, which is a function that's going to be run on the value that's entered. So what different properties can we extrapolate out here? If we have a look at what's returned from our hook, these are the things that we can then hook into and use. So we have our value, we have our is valid, we have has error, yeah, we have our value change handler, and we have our input blur handler, yeah, and then we have our reset. Cool. So now what we want to do is rename these for our specific component. So the first input that I'm going to add this to is just the logical first one here, which is the first name. So we'll add this to our input first name. So we'll call this first name perhaps. So first name value. first name value, and then we can have is valid can be first name is valid, because we're renaming these within our component here and we're naming them something logical how we're going to use them. So then we can say first name has error. We can call our value change handler, give it a new name in this component and call it our first name change handler. And then we also have our input blur change handler. So I'll just copy this. Ay, mamma mia, and paste it here. And rename it slightly. So this is going to be our first name blur handler. Cool. And then, and why is this giving out? Oh, comma, yeah. Oh, yeah, comma here. So there we can see that we have an error here. And if we hover over it, it's telling us a comma is expected. And I looked to the end of this line and seen a comma, but it's triggering it from somewhere. And it's the line above here. We just forgot a comma. So then that blurry line, our error line, will go away. And then what type of function do you think we might want to pass into a name handler? Well, so far we've been checking that the value that comes in, we run our function on this. So then that the value dot trim is not greater than this. So that's what we want to check, that the value dot trim is not this. So just let me go back and check our simple input and make sure, yes, so it's not equal to, okay, yeah, I had a feeling I was doing that slightly incorrectly there. So our value dot trim is not equal to just an empty string then. So not equal to empty string, close back off our parentheses, and then our return is down on the next line. Perfect. So now we can actually hook these into our input here. So we have our input of type text, ID of name. We'll add in a few more components here. So we can also add in an on change, and this will be, so when something changes, what we want to do is run our value change handler. And then on blur, we want to add in, on blur, we want to add in our blur change handler. So these methods have been predefined in our hook and we're just using them here. So this should actually be first name change handler. We need to give it the specific name. And then this is the reference for in this component, and that goes and uses this component then. So then we want to make the form not submittable if we have an error. So we will say disabled if has error. So if first name has error, we don't want to be able to submit this form. So cool. Yes. And then what else do we need? We also need to use our value here to feed back into the form. So we just give the value prop and equal that to this value that we're using, which is our first name value, and close off our parentheses there. And then I think if we save, we should be doing pretty well now. Simple input is defined but never used. Basic form. First name is valid is assigned but a value is never used. So yes, so what we also want to do then is, yeah, we have this check form is valid. Is valid, yeah. So this should say first name is valid, yes, yes. And where did we want to use that validity again? So on the on submit of the form. So instead we actually need an if statement here. It's going to say if first name is valid is true, then we want to set is valid to true. And we need a state management in here, or are we using that from somewhere else? I think we're using that from here. Is valid, first name is valid. So is valid, and this is where we should be in our hook, is valid. Okay, no, so this is how they've done it here. Yes, so we are creating our own form is valid variable. So that's what we're going to set here. So we'll have a let is form valid boolean that we are creating, and we'll first set this to false. So initially the form is not valid. Then we're going to come in here and say if the first name is valid, then we're going to set is form valid to true, and then we can use this is form valid. Yeah, this should just be equal. We're not setting this like state. This is just a boolean. So like so, whereas if it was state, you would use the function for the state and pass in the variable, excuse me. And then down here on our disabled, we want to actually disable it if is form is valid. And then what we use for this first name has error. If we have an error, we want to display a paragraph saying you have an error. So that's what that's for there. So we'll stick that actually underneath our input box within this form control area. So within our name form control area, we'll open up a paragraph and say, open up our curly brackets, put first name has error. If first name has error, then we want to display the paragraph. So our p tag should actually be in here, and close that off. This should also be in here. Yeah, and then this can go. Yes, and we will say please enter a first name. And now we have a validation message and everything. So we'll save that, and let's say, there we go, brilliant. So we have our error message showing up. We know if it's invalid. What if we just do a few spaces? We shouldn't be able to submit there because our button should indeed be disabled. Okay, so this is form valid. So if the form is not valid, we want to disable it. So there we go. Look, now we cannot submit. So perfect. We just had the logic the wrong way around. So now if I just do a space, we're only validating this first name at the moment. So we can see the submit button is still off. But then if I type in something, because all we're doing is checking that there is something typed into that box. So now we have something typed in, and the value dot trim is not equal to an empty space. So here it's not. Once we trim out the empty space, we get Lily. So then we can submit, and perfect. So we have that working now on our form, and we haven't actually reset the form either. So where were we resetting the form in here? Oh yeah, you need a form submission handler. Yes. Yeah, so we also need to add something for when we click this button. What's actually happening when we click that button. So we'll do the same thing that we did previously in our simple input. So this is just to check if the form is valid. Above that, I will add our constant. So submit form handler. And this is going to be equal to a function, an arrow function. And in here we want to say, yeah, event.prevent default first of all, because this is just something we say to prevent the default behavior, and then we can write our own behavior. And we should take in the event, obviously, if we are expecting an event down below, we need that event. And then we just check if our, first name is valid. So if our first name is not valid, so we'll say if it is not valid, then we just want to return and not submit the form. So we can just return out because it's not valid. Return. And then in the other case that it is valid, what we want to do is reset our first name value. Yes. So our first name value, where are they getting this name input reset from? Okay, so I actually give that a name as well. So this can be first name reset. So we can actually use it in this component, and then we will use this to set our first name reset back to nothing. We want to clear the form on submission. And yeah, that's okay for now. So perfect. So we have our name one done out, and now we'll do our second name, and we will do our email address. So there's our second name, and there's our email. So here this is going to be, and you can just copy this, highlight this, and do CTRL and F to find it. And then if you use this drop down, you can replace first with last, just to make this easy. And then this, you can click through. You can replace them all, which we don't want to do because further above we have first names that we actually want, but you can just do it one by one and replace them. So now that's all done. And then now down here, what we want to replace first with is email, because it's going to be email. So first name, that whole thing can be just replaced with email. So there you go. It's a handy way to do that. And that's perfect. So we'll just X out of our find and replace there. Now we have our few bits set up, and now we can hook these up to our other form component. So we have our input here, which is our type of text. This is our ID of name. This is for the last name. So we will say now on change, and this is going to be the last name change handler. Then we have our on blur, and this is going to be our last name blur handler. Cool. Then we have our value, and our value is going to be our last name value. And then underneath this input, so that's just all within the input, and then we also want to add this conditionally rendered bit of code if we have an error. So if the last name has an error, if this is true, then and display this paragraph, and the paragraph is going to be please write a valid last name. So we'll do that now. So please enter a valid last name. Awesome. And now we can do the same for email. So here's our email input. We have our type of text, our name. We want our on change handler. We will equal this to email change handler. We want our on blur. We will equal this to our on blur, or no, our blur email blur handler. Then we want our value, which is going to be our email value. Yep. And then we'll just add our paragraph in the case that there is an error. So we want to conditionally show if email has error. So if this is true, then and show this paragraph. So P, our little P tags to denote that this is a paragraph. Close it off, and then we just type in our message in here. So please enter a valid email address. Cool. And what we want to do actually is we do just want to change our, we need other functions. So here we've passed in the trim, which that's actually okay for the last name and the first name. We'll just make sure that something has been passed in. But for the email, we want to do a slightly different validation. So what we'll do instead is if the value dot includes an @ symbol, because that's a good marker, good piece of validation for an email. Do we have an @ symbol? And then that'll give us a bit of a better idea. And then we also just want to come in here to our submit form handler and not just set the first name, but the last name and the email as well. So we'll just say last name reset, and our email reset. Perfecto selecto. And then we need to call this submit form handler down here. So we say on submit, and then just pass in this function. So there we go. We want to run our submit form handler on submit. So now when we click the submit button, perfect, that should run. So now if I save, I did not spell submit correctly. So if I spell that correctly, save, reload the page just to be sure. And let's check. So we have our first name, we have our last name message, and we have our email address message. Brilliant. So if I put a text into either of those, the error messages goes away. Great. If I put an @ symbol in here, great, the error message goes away, and we can now submit. So absolutely perfect. So if you haven't noticed, we're missing one thing. We don't have the coloration on those boxes. So in order to do that, and here we shouldn't be checking if just the first name is valid. In order to allow submission, we should say if the first name is valid and last name is valid, and if the email is valid. So if all of these three things are valid, then set the form as valid boolean to true and allow us to then submit the form. And what we also just want to add here, I'd like a few spaces around these functions. What I'd also like to add here is our, what was the last thing I was thinking of? Oh yeah, our different classes that are going to switch on and off the coloration for these different components. So we'll add that down here. We can say constant, name, first name, input classes, because it's the classes that are going to be applied, the CSS classes that are going to be applied, dependent on whether this boolean is true or false. So here we have our first name has error. So if first name has error, if that is indeed true, then what we want to do is add the class form control and invalid. So we'll add these two classes, invalid. And in the case that it's not true, then we want to just add form control. Cool. And then I'm going to do something similar for the email and for our email and for our last name. So last name has error, can be pasted here, last name, and then just email has error. And then these should be used as classes on our actual forms here. So here on our, where did we put them down? Here. So where did we actually use these then? On the boxes, I presume. Yeah. So wrapping the whole div. So wrapping the whole div, we're going to use this class name, which is conditionally changing dependent on whether or not we have errors. So here, this is our wrapping div here. Oh yeah, we already have form control there. So rather than form control, we'll add our brackets to determine whether or not this has errors or not. And if it doesn't have any errors, it applies just form control. If it does, it applies form control invalid. So we'll also just have to go and check if we have got that CSS class tied to this particular component. So let's do that as well. So then we have last name, input classes. Cool. Because we're adding the classes dependent on whether or not we have errors. So I'll add that in there. And then for our third one here, our email, this also needs to go. And instead we have email form, email. Okay, so I never actually renamed it. Email input classes, Cool. So if I copy this, paste this down below, yeah, in here, and then let's just go and check our associated CSS file to make sure that we do indeed have those classes. So it looks like these are actually coming from our app CSS class. So we don't have a CSS class specifically for our basic form or our simple input. It's all coming from the main project CSS. So it will apply in that case. So if we reload, because that applies to all the components. So now if we leave it blank, we get our red. Great. Now, excuse me, what if I change this? Still can't submit, but the error goes away. What if I add in a key? Great, we don't get the error. If we just click in and out, the error stays. I cannot submit at the moment, just adding spaces. And as soon as I add an @ because this is the validation, we can then submit. And you've seen our form got wiped. So that's brilliant. That is all working as expected. So I'm actually going to just commit now to say new terminal. So we'll go git add everything. And we'll worry about the rest of that in a moment. I'm just going to listen to the video here. I went well ahead, so I just have to catch up now and see what's going on. Okay guys, so what we're moving on to now what we're moving on to now is practicing a bit more with use reducer. So if we come back up here and import use reducer, so we just have to import that actually. Well, we're going to use it in our hook. So yes, back over here in our use input hook that we've created, I'll get rid of this search area and we can just import that from React. So I'll add it to this same import object, excuse me. So use reducer, there we go. And now let's see what Max is gonna do. So we'll bundle these two state objects with use reducer instead. So up here we say const input state. Yeah, so we have our state, which is our previous state of the object, and then our action, which is the action that you're going to give it to dispatch on this old state object, or however you wish. So then we open up our function here and let's get going. So yeah, we want to return a new state snapshot. So cool. So it could be our value, which is just an empty string, and then is touched, which is going to start as false. Cool. Okay. Cool. So what we're going to do is now we are going to use this input state reducer down here instead. So then we're going to say, instead of these two use state objects, we're going to instead have use reducer, and in here we are going to pass our input state reducer, and we'll also pass in our initial input state. And what this is we're going to extract out, this is our initial state here, value of nothing and value is touched as false. So we can extrapolate this out into its own object. So we'll just say const initial input state is equal to an object, and this is the object. And then what we can do is return this instead. So cool, we just literally return that item like so, and then perfect. Okay, so now we need to also use this. Okay, so what use reducer returns is two different things. So we have a constant, and we're going to take out these two items that use reducer is going to return, and what they are is our input state and our dispatch. Yeah, so how we want to actually use this. So this is what it returns back, and then we're going to implement them. Okay. Okay, so now when our value is valid here, now when our value is valid, when we're validating the value we want to actually validate now is our input state dot value. Yeah, input state dot value, and we can do the same for the is touched. This is now going to be our input state dot is touched. Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah. Cool. So then we can actually dispatch that our use reducer within our value change handler. So we just call dispatch, and then we pass in an object, and the object, it contains our keyword, which is which type of function we want to dispatch, and then the value as well. So then we have our type, which is just going to be input, which is just a identifier for the particular function we actually want to dispatch when we come in here to this value change handler, and then the value, which is going to be our input, our event.target.value, event.target.value, so the actual value coming in here, dot value. So cool, perfect. And then we can do the same for our input blur handler. So here we will have our blur, and we can also remove the set entered value, because we're just doing it a slightly different way now. We don't have a set entered value for our entered value state management. We're doing it through use reducer, so we can get rid of this now, and we're now dispatching the input function on the event.target.value, which is going to do what this set entered value did anyway. So then in here, in our input blur handler, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to dispatch a different function in here. So we'll say dispatch, and this will be type dispatch, and we will do a comma, and we want to pass in the value as well here. Oh no, well he just has dispatch type blur, and then also for the set entered value, yeah, for our reset, what we want to do instead is dispatch a reset function, which is going to do these two operations: set entered value to nothing, and then set is touch to false. So here we will dispatch another function that's going to handle that for us now in a moment, and this is going to be of type reset. Perfect, cool. And let's keep watching. Okay. And then the only difference is then in our return, rather than returning our entered value, we want to return our input state dot value, because this is where our value is being saved now and tracked. So cool. Yeah. So up here in our dispatch handler now, we need to create these three functions that are going to do something dependent on which type we've passed through. So we can say if action dot type is equal to input, then we want to do this. And if action dot type is, this is going to be input, what was the second one? Blur. And then reset. Blur. Let's open up our parentheses, and I'll just copy this because why not, and paste it, and then we will say reset here. Perfecto selecto, and then we want to say what we actually want to do in here. So what we want to do in the case that we have the input coming in, we want to return and open up my curly parentheses, our value, and our value is just going to be our action.value, so the value that's coming in, and then also is touched to state.isTouched. Is touched, cool. Then in our blur, we also want to return a new object. Okay, cool. So what we want to do in blur, when we've actually blurred, come in here and we've checked that the action type being passed through is blur, all we want to do is set is touched to true, because that's all the is blur is doing, is just checking whether or not the field has been touched. So we can pass that in, and then we'll pass back our value of state.value. Cool. And let's keep watching. And then here I'll set is touched to false in the case that we're resetting it. So cool. Okay. So all we're going to do in here is set is touched to false anyway. But I'll just make sure. And we want to set value back to empty string, of course. Yeah, that's what we were doing. So cool. So now this should work. If I save and check. So we see we're still using set is touched on line 32. So where's that? Line 32. Set is touched. Oh yeah, so we can just get rid of that. All we want to do in the input blur handler is just select the type dispatch, and then when we run that dispatch, when we realize that that's the one we have, this should be blur. Once we realize that the type is blur, what we want to do is set is touched to true and set the value to state.value, so just the current value that's already there. So if I reload now and click out, we see we have our validation error messages. If I type in something and submit, perfect, everything gets set back to empty. So we're doing well. Great. Super. Cool. Yeah, so we just did that as an extra exercise just to use reducer again. And we can also remove our use state here because we don't need that for the time being. So guys, we are starting to go back now to an old project. And what we're going to do is go back to our meals ordering application, which is fantastic because I was really enjoying that. So we'll just get up our Firebase here. Console. Firebase, cool. And log in. And see what's going down around the town. So let's get started here. No, go to console. We don't need to get started. We already did that. So here we have our Max Complete React database. And we want to go to our real-time database here in your side menu. And then we're going to add a new section and we're going to call this meals. So I can just come to the plus, add meals. Great. Oh, maybe not great. Let's try that again. Meals. And then let's add some actual meals in here. So can you see that? Not really. No. Okay. So just going to see what Max is adding. Okay. So we're going to add our meals data into Firebase here. So where are our meals? Let's go and find those. So we'll search for meals. Dummy meals we had our dummy meals. Here we go. Our constant dummy meals. So we're just going to add these into our Firebase database here now. So let's do that. So our name is going to be cool. So first of all, we start off by giving it an ID. So this can just be M1 for meal 1. Why you do this to me, eh? So our name will be meals. Then we will add in our ID, which is going to be M1. Then we'll add another line, and this will be sushi. Yeah. Okay, sorry. So name should be sushi. Or no, name should be name. Value should be sushi. Then we have... How did he do that? Yeah. So we start with our name field. We add in our sushi. Okay, then we click add. Cool. So now we can add more nested data in here. So we'll also add our description. And the value is going to be fresh fish and veggies. And then we also want to add our price. So our price will be $22.99, baby. Feeling fine. So we'll copy this and add that in as our value and then click add. So we're just adding these into our database here, and then we can add in another meal. So we'll add in M2. Yeah. Click add. And then we'll say name. Schnitzel. Okay, then we will add. Okay, so we just have schnitzel, but we also want to add in those other description and price. So description is going to be a German speciality. Indeed, it is a schnitzel. And we'll paste that into the value, and we will add one more. So we go back up here to M2 and we will add in our price. And our price is going to be $16.50. Cool. And add. And then we want to add in a third meal. So we'll come back up here to our meals. We'll add M3. Hitting enter doesn't work, guys, just so you know. And then here we have our name. Our name is going to be barbecue burger. We got a barbecue burger. I would love one of them maybe, even though I sort of eat veggies. And then M3, this can be our description. We're just adding in the various fields here. An American raw meaty. Oh Jesus, you can keep that actually. The first line, you've had me tantalised. The second line, not so much. Price, for $12.99, we'll take one anyway. So we'll add in our price here of only $12.99. You got me sold. I'll take the burger. $12.99. Especially over the schnitzel. So great. And then we'll add in one more meal. Yeah, M4. M4, we'll add that. Oh, come on, mate. I don't bloody know what you'd be doing sometimes, innit? Meals. Add another. M4, innit? Add another line. We have our name, which is going to be green bowl. This is what I'd like. I love a green bowl. I'm not even joking. I know it sounds mental, but I'm a big fan. So we have our green bowl. We'll add in another line here. We have our description. Oh, I'd be making my dad eat green stuff. It's hilarious. Like whenever I make him a green smoothie, which is like kale, spinach, celery, some ginger in there. We get some coconut milk perhaps. You know, I always make him one up and I'm like, oh, taste this, Dad, taste this. And his answer is just always, it tastes so green. I think they taste lovely, but he just thinks it tastes green. Fantastic. So there we go. So now we have our 4 different items here in our database. So we can see we have our meal 1, meal 2, meal 3 and meal 4. And we have our various information in there about them. So that's great. Now we're going to pull this data in from Firebase as opposed to from this dummy array. We'll actually interact with an API and get it back from a database. So this is great. So he's just going still through his American raw and meaty here. Cool. Great. Yeah, so now we're going to get this data back from the server instead of this dummy meal array, as I was saying. So we can just get rid of that for the moment. And we'll pull it in from our backend instead. So I'll just commit where we're at, new terminal, while he's chatting there. Let's just add everything and then we can come back to that. Cool. So now what we're going to do is in our const available meals here, where we're actually getting these meals, we're going to add in a use effect hook because we're calling out to a database. So that's where these are very useful. And we just want an arrow function in here. And in here we will say fetch, go and get the data, open up our parentheses, pass in the URL of our database, which is this here. So if I just copy this, go. Did that copy it, or what you doing, mate? So if we copy, pass that into our fetch, this should get that data. We have our exact right thing in here. He has a .js. Let's leave the .js out for the moment and see if it still works, because this is the URL that they've given us. So it would be strange if they should have included a .js to call this URL and they just didn't include it. So I'm going to just try it as it is, and if not, we know what's wrong. And then let's close all of these. And then we also just pass in our dependencies to this use effect. So for the moment, we'll just pass an empty array. And there we go. Yeah. Yeah. So a second thing you can pass into the fetch here is another object, and you can perhaps call out specific requests that you want to make. But for a get, it defaults to a get if you don't pass in any additional information. And we're just using a get request at the moment to get this data back from the backend. So we can leave it as is. So that's fine, yeah. Cool. Yeah, and what fetch does is return a promise. So then we can add a dot then. So what we want to do after, this is going to be an arrow function. So cool. What do we want to do then? Or use async await, yeah, which makes more sense because we want to do it the, you know, up-to-date way, which async await is just a more modern way of doing your API requests, a more modern way of doing a promise, so that you can't go into callback hell. You don't have callback hell when you use async await. That's why they were created. Okay. Okay, so use effect doesn't return a promise. It returns something else. Okay, so rather than the function that you pass to use effect returning a promise, it returns a cleanup function. So that's what use effect actually returns here. So whether or not async await is perfect here, I'm not sure, because it's not going to return a promise when we use effect. Okay, so for that reason we don't turn it into an asynchronous function. So okay, that made sense to me when we were doing it, but not within use effect, because you're returning a cleanup function, not a promise. Okay. Cool. So what we can actually do is, rather than calling it exactly on the use effect, we just create a new function in here. So we say const get meals or fetch meals, which is going to just be an arrow function. And we'll open up our brackets, and then in here we'll do the fetch, and then we can make this async await. So here we will add our async, yeah, and then here we add our await, and then we can just call that function within our use effect. So then we just say fetch meals and run it. Perfect. Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, so rather than adding the async on the use effect itself, that's not good practice because use effect, as we said, is returning a cleanup function. So instead you can just define your function within that that's going to do the asynchronous call, get the data from the server, make sure it's there, wait for it, and await that information, and then the use effect is still just a use effect which returns the cleanup function. Cool. Yes, yes, yes. So we're going to assign this to our response. This is what we want our response to be. So const response is equal to this. And then we'll just define another constant here. And this is going to be our response data, which is just our response and JSON-ified. So we just say await response dot JSON, transform it into a JSON. So there we go, and then we can return this response data is what I imagine we're going to do. So yeah. Okay. 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 Okay, so the way that Firebase returns this information is it will be in an object. So we'll have the key pair of M1 and then the value will be an object containing all of this information. But we actually want to display it in an array so we can then loop through the array or for further on how we want to actually use this data. So what we will do is transform it from an object to an array up after we've received the data. So that's what we're going to do now. Declare another constant and call this loaded meals. Loaded meals, which is just going to be an empty array. And then we're going to loop over each of those meals. So we'll say for meals. So we should just actually say for constant, and let's call this key instead in response data. So let's loop over each of the objects we've got back from our response data, and then we just want to push them into this array. So we'll say loaded meals dot push, so push into this new array we've created, and then we just want to push in our objects the way we want them. So that's going to be calling out each of these different things that we're going to receive back from the database. So we have our ID, which is our key. Then we need our name, description, and price. So we'll have name is our response data dot name, our description, which is our response data dot description, and our price. Cool. So now we're actually transforming that data that we get back into the way we want to display it. So our response data.name is just going to be assigned to this name property. So then we can access that still with the .name. So okay. So we also need use state because we're going to track the state of this too. So we're not using our fragment anymore. I'll replace that with use state. And then we're going to use state within our component function here. So const equal to use state. Cool. And Okay, so this is going to be our meals and then set meals function. Meals and set meals. Cool. Yeah. To update the state of the meals. And then down here, we can loop through our meals instead of our dummy meals. Because we were previously looping through dummy meals. So now we will loop through just our meals and save that. Cool. So then once we have come in here and we have fetched our meals and we've pushed our meals into this for loop. So this, yes, okay, yes. So once we have come out of our for loop, then we want to set the state of our meals. So set meals and set them to our loaded meals. So we're tracking the state of those loaded meals. If something was to change, it will update it when you're setting the state of it. Okay. Yeah, and also for our fetch meals, currently, we have an empty dependency array, but it looks like we're going to need some dependencies. Okay. Okay, so down here we have an empty dependency array, and basically when do we want all of this code to run? When do we want to fetch our meals? We want to fetch our meals when we first load up the page. So, and we're not dependent on anything in here, you know, of any external things, anything else updating. So we can leave our dependency array empty because we do only want this function to run when we first load up the page, get our meals, that's grand. So that's fine for now. So we just leave our dependencies array as it is. So then if I save and go back to the project, let's just make sure we're fired up here. So a new terminal. So what folder are we even in here? So let's just check it out. 0111. So let's cd into our 11 folder. Not 22. Come on now. Code 01. And then we'll do npm start, and we might just need to shut down our other running instance, or it'll just tell you, do you want to start this on a new terminal, which we could easily, on a new port, which we could just say yes. But I'll just close down the other one and fire it up in port 3000 as we have been seeing this. But if you already have something running, it will ask you if you want to run it somewhere else. So that's all good. So let's see this now once it fires up and see where we're at. Fingers crossed we still have some meals here. I'm expecting we will. So let's see. Let's see what happens. So we have a problem. Meals is undefined. This meals here. Is it? Okay, so it's telling us when we're trying to loop through our meals. Well, our meals should be set from the loaded meals. So let's just try and pass in loaded meals instead, which it shouldn't be able to do this loop on because, okay, yeah, we're not even sending that back out. So set meals is setting the state of the meals for the whole component here. So meals, come on now, what you doing? So let's just console log out meal here. Might be helpful. I'll just, where did I go? I'll just put this into brackets as well, because we want to pass in that meal there, which shouldn't be necessary. But look, let's just close out any questions we have here, and then let's console log our meals. So log meals, and I'll just copy this and paste. Oh, I meant to put one of these in quotes just so we could actually have a string saying meals and then put out the meals themselves. We do not need colon there. I'll just, where's this coming from? Yes, from our map. Okay, there's our console log. Okay, let's just console log out a meal. Doesn't look like it's getting the meals, so let's comment this out for the time being, because this is where we're using each of the meals to populate it into a meal item. But for the time being, I just want to try and see what's going on with my meals. So meals is still undefined. Let's reload this. Okay, right, so that's okay. We're going to figure this out, but we've hit the hour. So I'm doing a quick escape plan and going to leave it there, and we will figure this out in the next video. And yeah, we'll see what the story is, why we can't get our meals, and we'll just pick up exactly where we left off. So thanks so much for joining me, guys. Have an absolutely fabulous day as always, and much love from me, Lilly Code. Thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. Thank you.